Welcome back to the Mature Male Podcast. I'm your host, Wes, a psychotherapist helping men mature through timeless wisdom and practical guidance. Today's guest is Tim Fletcher. Tim is a trauma recovery specialist and founder of Tim Fletcher Company. He's dedicated over 18 years to developing comprehensive treatment approaches for complex trauma and addiction recovery, starting his career as a pastor for over 30 years before transitioning into addiction counseling. Tim recognized the critical connection between childhood trauma and adult behavioral patterns. He's the creator of the in-person REACT program, Recovery Education for Addictions and Complex Trauma, which has achieved remarkable success with over 68% recovery rates from addictions. Tim has identified 60 characteristics of complex trauma and dedicated and developed practical tools that help individuals understand and heal from their past while building healthier coping mechanisms for their future. Tim, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Excited to chat. So you've discovered that 97% of people struggling with addictions also have complex trauma, corroborating Dr. Gabor Mate, one of my favorite people in this space's research. For men who may be struggling with behaviors they can't quite understand, whether it's anger, emotional numbness, workaholism, or other compulsive patterns, can you help them understand what complex trauma actually is and how it might be showing up in their adult lives without them realizing it?
Yeah, I think the way I would start with that, Wes, is a lot of people get focused on addiction and it's really a symptom, but it's only one of the ways of coping with trauma. It's a way of kind of finding some pleasure when you didn't have much pleasure, filling the emptiness, medicating all the pain that you're feeling and you can't resolve. And so a lot of people get fixated on just addiction. And to me, it's just one of many symptoms that come out of childhood trauma. So childhood complex trauma is when a child perceives that they're not safe on an ongoing basis. So that we typically think of trauma in terms of horrific events that abuse, those kind of things. And that's definitely an element of trauma. But for most people with complex trauma, it's what I call little t trauma. It's more the neglect trauma. So it's the needs that should have been met, your emotional needs that weren't met. And so it's not that something bad happened to you. It's something that good that should have happened to you didn't. And it's like it's invisible trauma. And people go, well, that happens to everybody. That seems insignificant. And I go, no, because we know it has the exact same effect on the brain as horrific events do. Because the child is supposed to be getting a need met and it's not. And they feel all alone. They feel it's their fault. They've done something wrong. They don't feel safe. They feel abandoned. And that has the exact same effect as that big T horrific stuff. So what happens within the child is my needs aren't being met. I think it must be my fault. I must be doing something wrong. So I need to adapt. So they begin to adapt. So now I'll be the perfect child. Now I'll do more chores. And they become codependent. They become people pleasers. They become perfectionists. If I do everything perfect, then dad will love me and meet my needs. And so they're doing all these adaptations that for many of the children, they seem to be working. They're getting some of their needs met. They're not getting hurt as much. And so they start a whole bunch of different adaptations that 30, 40 years later, they realize, wow, these not trusting anybody, people pleasing perfectionist is now messing up all my adult relationships. So maybe these adaptations are actually maladaptations, but they seem to work. They let me survive physically as a child. And that's the key thing. As they're adapting, there's other things that are happening inside of them. So they can't be authentic anymore. They have to be something other than who they truly are in order to get their needs met and not get hurt. They can't connect with adults being authentic. They have to kind of find a fake type of connection by adapting. So their connection needs not being met. Their authentic needs aren't being met. They don't feel accepted. And they feel it's all their fault. So there's this deep anger that starts to form. Something's wrong here. I am being neglected, mistreated, not accepted. Nobody wants to connect with me. And I get more and more angry. And then that leads to depression. That leads to anxiety. Will everybody treat me this way? Life sucks. And then what's happening in your brain is, When a child's in a safe environment and they're able to connect with safe people emotionally, where they feel totally accepted, heard, seen, the brain releases all the good chemicals, dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin. But when they can't connect and can't be authentic, and there's now shame and anger happening, none of those positive chemicals are being released. So their emotional world is feeling very negative, dark, and lots of pain. And now it's so their needs aren't being met. They've got pain from that, but now they can't resolve the pain. They're trying to adapt, but it's still not fixing the problem. And so the pain just keeps compounding more and more. And so once they find drugs and alcohol, they go, I think I just found the solution because my pain's gone. I feel happy now. It takes me out of this painful circumstance. And so they see drugs, alcohol, or any other type of addiction, food addiction, sex addiction, whatever, as now providing the solution to all their unmet needs. So that's where we've developed all of the different characteristics besides addiction that come out of a child whose needs aren't met and then doesn't feel safe, and all the maladaptations they have to build into their life in order to try to survive.
Thanks for laying the groundwork there. And that is the next question I wanted to get into about the characteristics. But before we do, I'm curious when it comes to the classic addictions, the ones we most know. My understanding is that the majority of those are men, at least when it comes to alcohol and sex. Am I right on that?
I would say that's changing.
Okay.
So when I started over 20 years ago, most of the people in treatment were men. But in the last 10 years, I'm seeing that it's just as much women as men. And so I think there was an element culturally that men could get help and they didn't get shamed as much as women. If they admitted they had an alcohol problem or a drug problem, they would get shamed because they were supposed to be the responsible mothers. And so they kept it more secret, hidden. And it's just that's kind of gone and it's more open. And I think there's just been a growing experiment amongst all genders with all of the different things available in our culture that is leading to addiction. So I would say right now in our programs, it's about 50 on average between men and women.
That's good insight because I think many of us are just fed the more stereotypical stats and we fall into that. And it's good to know the updated trends that you're seeing in the recovery. And I'm curious because many guys may not be at the spot where they are ready to seek help, but they're experiencing the exact process you're naming. What are some more immediate and practical, simple tools that they can use to start to be aware of the anger, the numbness, the ways that they express the symptomology of the complex trauma?
Yeah, how I would lead into that, Wes, would really be think what most people need to understand when it comes to complex trauma is there's always an element of denial. So the child being in the present is just too painful. So they need to do kind of two things. They need to dissociate from the present because I want to be anywhere but in the present and present to the present. So I need to be distracted. I need to be in a fantasy world. I need to be out with my buddies having fun just so I don't have to feel or think. So that's part one. But then there's always an element of denial. It's not as bad as it others. Oh, everybody goes through this. So we minimize, we rationalize, we justify, but we don't fully look at it head on and accurately. There's always an element of denial. And so what happens for a lot of people as all of these adaptations gradually have more and more negative consequences, and you realize, I think maybe these are maladaptations, is there still the denial that goes, but yes, they're still working a bit. Still, yeah, there's some negative stuff, but there's some still positive stuff happening when I lie, when I get angry, I get my needs met. When I'm a people pleaser, when I'm a perfectionist, when I'm really hard on myself, all of those different things, they go, there's still positives. And so they go through really a stage where the denial is breaking down because the negatives are piling up and the positives are getting less and less. And they get to basically greater and greater pain. But in that time is when, before they're really ready to make changes and say, I gotta get my life fixed, they start doing investigations. And typically they go on the internet, etc. But typically what happens for a lot of people is initially looking for a magic fix for the symptoms. How can I make the symptoms go away? And really, I don't want to deal with anything from childhood. I don't want to deal with any deep pain. I don't want to open that can of worms. So let's just try to find a magic solution to everything. And so they try different things and usually find out that those don't work. And so typically it's a process of a couple of years before they finally get to the point where they go, there's no magic fix. The problems, I can't blame everybody else. It's something in me that needs to be looked at and changed. So at that point, to me, that's where people can watch like our YouTube videos and start to get information that connects dots and in a non-judgmental way helps explain, yeah, you were in survival mode as a child. You had to do this to survive. Don't beat yourself up, but it's not working anymore. You can change. The other thing that we've done is we've made a bunch of different little self-study programs that people can do on anger, on codependency, on different things that they begin to realize as adults are starting to cause them problems. So you're now hurting the people you love is usually the pain that finally drives them to say, I got to do something.
Thanks for laying that out. And we'll make sure, of course, to put all the resources in the show notes. And I really appreciate your framing of the pain. And I often tell clients that until the pain of where you're at and the repercussions of that is greater than the pain of the unknown or the fear of change, then you'll always stay where you're at. But once it reaches that tipping point, and to your point, that it's usually involving negatively affecting someone else, because a lot of addiction starts with thinking I can manage it on my own. And when it starts to inevitably spill over into affecting others, as it does, it's helpful to know that is usually the point someone can look for to say, man, if I haven't reached this level of pain and the awareness of it and the effects of it on others, then I'm probably not going to change, or it would take a lot to change. So I appreciate that framework.
Thanks.
And earlier you mentioned the characteristics. So let's talk about that. You've identified what you call the 60 characteristics of complex trauma. Many men have been conditioned to be strong and not show vulnerability, which can make it difficult to recognize these trauma responses. What are some of the most common characteristics you see in men that might dismiss just being tough or handling business, but are actually trauma responses that are keeping them stuck?
Wonderful question. Let me start with this perspective and framework. Like, I think a lot of men in Western culture have actually been taught a toxic masculinity, and it basically is a complex trauma mindset that a child would have. So if you look at a child, a little boy growing up, and all of a sudden they're being neglected or abused or hurt in all kinds of different ways, and then they start crying, they're told big boys don't cry. They're told quit being so sensitive. And so all of a sudden they realize if I show that emotion, it makes me vulnerable to get hurt even more. So I need to stuff that emotion down. I need to be strong. And so strength now gets defined as being less human. So strength ultimately grows into, I just need to be a brain without emotions. And that you become this walking brain or a robot that emotions are shut down. And what people, many men especially, are able to really push emotions down, they push it to their subconscious. They think they've got rid of them. They don't realize that those emotions in their subconscious are still affected. And that's the key thing to me is you think you've got rid of your emotions and disconnected and repressed everything. You haven't. It's just gone to your subconscious world, and it still has a ton of power in that world. And that's what can get triggered by events that cause you to go off the handle and your anger to just overflow, and you lash out and hurt all kinds of people. And if you feel disrespected, not heard, not understood, stupid, embarrassed, fearful, whatever. So some of the emotions that men end up thinking are weak are empathy, sadness, sensitivity, fear, anxiety, depression, all of that. They just think that makes me weak, that makes me vulnerable, so I got to shove it down. And bottom line to me is that's not true manhood. That is a toxic masculinity that makes you actually less human, less weak, makes you incapable of truly meaningful, intimate relationships, hampers your ability to be a good father, to your children. And so it might make you so you feel you're not getting hurt as much, but you're hurting yourself and you're going to hurt others eventually. And so it's really helping people realize that this stuffing of emotions for men has been a huge issue that they think is a strength in men, but it's actually, to me, a weakness. And what I have found is we get so many different women that have had fathers like that and have been deeply hurt by those fathers. And we have men that have been hurt by those fathers. But they're afraid to become vulnerable again. They're afraid to become authentic. They're afraid to go into their emotional world and experience all of their emotions. But when they do, what they find is it actually makes them stronger. It actually makes people respect them even more and want to connect with them, want to follow them. So a strong leader is not a shut down man. A strong leader is a vulnerable, totally human man. So that's one of the things. But I would say a lot of people, when we first started our programs, they go, okay, I don't connect to the trauma. I don't connect to the addiction. So I don't think your program's for me. And so I developed the characteristics, and we now have 87 characteristics, just so you know. But it was, what are other ways that the maladaptions work out, that people respond to trauma to survive? And so it's that anger issues. And I started to identify the ones that most men could relate to, that had an intense emotional piece to them that they might not be able to talk about. There might be a stigma around talking about it. So it's more process addictions. So gambling, food, sex, pornography, all of those types of addictions. Workaholism is a massive one, video games, all of that. So there's an element of addictions that a lot of people don't realize that they're actually addictions. And for some, it's relationship addiction. They just have to be in love. They got to be in a relationship. But then it went to just, there's problems with managing their anger that keep showing up, trust issues, control issues, shame issues, honesty, dishonesty issues, repression of emotions, trouble in regulating their emotions once they get triggered. So just more and more developed all of the different ways that complex trauma alters a person in a negative way. And a lot of it's in the emotional world.
So you mentioned that for many men, the addiction is process based. Can you tell me more about that? Why, for men in particular, the addictions seem to follow that format or structure or nature versus, of course, some can have the relational based addiction, but it seems like the prominent structure is the process based.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely the drugs and alcohol are very much a thing. So if I take a child again in a complex trauma family, so their needs aren't being met, so they got pain there. They try to be authentic and express their needs. They try to connect. They get rejected. When they're authentic, they get judged, and so they get more and more pain that's happening. Lack of connection. Needs aren't being met. And so they got a growing anger, a growing emptiness, a growing pain threshold that's building inside of them. So if you look at what are the things that provide natural pleasure outside of drugs, alcohol, chemicals, well, it's based on our natural needs. A child finds, they go to grandma's and grandma says, you look sad, here's a cookie. And they eat a cookie and they go, oh, I feel better. Oh, maybe the solution to my emotional pain is food. So now they're trying to solve emotional pain with physical, meeting a physical need that wasn't designed to meet their emotional needs. And so they start a food addiction. Then they hit their puberty and they find all of a sudden sex, masturbation, and they go, wow, I have not felt so good in all my life. Every time I feel anxiety, depression, anger, any other negative emotion, I will masturbate, or they find porn. That makes me feel connected. It brings all the good chemicals to my brain. And so now they have addictions based on what were natural drives and needs, but now those drives and needs are being misused. So they're not being followed in a healthy way now. They're followed to try and meet emotional needs that they weren't designed to meet. And so to me, that's where those go. And then they start work. And for the first time, they get the validation they've always sought. Now they get position, respect, all the things they didn't get growing up. And they go, wow, this is finally meeting all of these other needs that I didn't get as a child. So I'm going to become a workaholic and I'm going to be the best that there is. And then they get money and they get some possessions and a nice house and a nice car. And now they get respect for that. People defer to them now because they've got money and they go, that just meant I'm going to get more and more money. So it's built on, all those addictions are built on the twisting and misuse of a natural healthy need. And that's where most people go. So what we find with, even with people who have drug and alcohol addictions, once they stop the drugs and alcohol, they usually start putting on weight. Why? Because now their brain goes, hey, I don't like feeling all this discomfort, and you're not going to let me use drugs and alcohol. So I'm going to go back to my earlier addictions, which is food, sex, all of those other things. And so they go back to the process. So the process addictions to me, for most people, are their earliest addictions. Once they hit drugs and alcohol, they don't even realize that they had process addictions. But once they go to stop drugs and alcohol, they go back to the process addiction.
Yeah, I appreciate that insight there, that so much of it is imprinted as a child based on the relationships that you have. And to your point, most of it's subconscious because you just think, oh, I had a cookie every time. It's just this or that. Or if it was normalized or if it wasn't addressed in your family, you're probably not going to be aware of it. And it's not until you hit those second and third layers of addiction that you're mentioning, you almost work your way backwards to say, okay,
Exactly.
after you abstain from that, and you realize, oh my gosh, like it was that the whole time at the core. Of course, it was layered, but that's a lot of good insight to know that for anyone struggling with it, that's where it may start.
I could add one other piece to that, Wes, that I think is important for people. It's really important to look at a child in complex trauma who's not getting their needs met and not getting the validation that they need, to look at the first thing they get validated for. And so that could be their sports ability. That could be their funny. That could be really pretty. That feels so good. That's like a rush of a drug. And so now they go, that just is meeting my needs. That is getting me the respect and validation I've always longed for. So now in their mind, they're no longer a human being. They always have to accomplish something in order to, but they got to keep the perfect body. They got to be the best athlete. They got to be the funniest person and never be serious, always be telling jokes, because that's the only way they're going to get their needs met. So now they become very much just focused on one area, that's where all my value comes from.
Yeah, it's almost as if that validation embodies the full understanding of identity.
Exactly.
And everything is enveloped in that, and they don't have the ability to see outside of that. So to your point, they, one, don't think that they can express who they are outside of that, but two, there's a codependency on that
Yes.
validation to say, unless I fit within this world or this box, then I don't know who I am. And then you fill it with all the other things that you're also not, to your point, where you're just going to keep filling and filling until you address that core wounding and the root of the trauma.
Exactly. One other thing that I would add is, so if you look at a child in complex trauma where their needs aren't being met and they begin and they're not able to connect. So two things happen. They think it's their fault. They don't feel good enough, but also they don't feel part of the family. They feel like a black sheep because they're not connecting with anybody. They don't feel like they belong. So now they're attracted because we're driven to connect, to attach, to belong. So now they're looking for peer groups to connect to. And what is in a Western culture? Well, we're going to go on a drinking party tonight. We're going to get smashed and have a party at so and so's house. And so all of a sudden, their way of belonging is, I got to drink to fit in. And then that can lead to addictions. And then you try other drugs. So again, so many deep core needs are not met properly in complex trauma families that the child then goes elsewhere to try to get those needs met. But now they have to conform. They have to earn love. They have to give or conform in order to be accepted. And they'll do whatever is required of them, which usually is something that's going to eventually hurt them.
Yeah, and to that point, it seems like almost all trauma inevitably has to be related to someone else, that it doesn't just happen in isolation. And you talk about how that trauma affects the ability to have healthy relationships and often leads to what you call people pleasing behaviors, or conversely, becoming overly controlling, which I was blessed with experience both of those through my trauma. So I'm curious, how did these patterns specifically show up in men's relationships, whether with their partners or children or in the workplace? And what's the path forward to developing more authentic connections, let's say healing the social bond that was ruptured in childhood?
Yeah, again, such a good question. So I think place to start is what makes to me complex trauma unique and important to understand is it's basically the only trauma that primarily takes place within relationships. It's relationship trauma. And it's the most intimate relationships that inflict the deepest wounds. So mom, dad, siblings, grandparents, people in authority that are close to them. So it's a relationship based trauma. The next part of it, though, is that since most of it happens within a family setting, most of it is starting to happen pre-verbal. So the child is experiencing it right from birth before they're able to talk. And so the brain doesn't have yet the words for the child to process, the emotions for the child to process. So it gets suppressed into the body, stored in the body, moved to the subconscious world, and they're adapting as a 1 year old, a 6 month year old at a subconscious place, even before they have words for it or understanding for it. So there's a whole bunch of different things that happen. So okay, the next thing is our initial response to danger is we get a shot of cortisol, adrenaline, go to fight or flight. That gives us extra energy to fight or run faster. But to a small child, they get the shot of cortisol. They're too little to fight. They're too little to run away. So they then go to the brain's next survival skill, which is let's now give a shot of natural opioids in the brain and let the child go into an internal dissociative world where they can freeze. So instead of escaping to an external world where they can find safety, that's impossible. Let's find an internal world. So opioids allows them to dissociate from the present and go to an internal world, and then it medicates pain in case they get hurt. And so freeze becomes the next survival thing. But then the problem for a little child is I'm still too little to meet my needs. I need somebody to be there. So the brain goes to a fourth survival skill, which is fawning. So let's now people please. Let's now be a chameleon. Let's now wear masks. Let's now be the hero child. Let's now be the best athlete, the most funny guy. Let's develop all kinds of roles and behavioral things that will get them to like us enough that they will keep meeting our needs a little bit. And so fawning becomes what most people do. But the problem with fawning is in complex trauma families, the child now gets validated because they're conforming. They're more attuned to mom and dad's moods and mom and dad's values and beliefs than to their own needs, their own moods, their own thinking. And so their radar is now set on what do mom and dad need and want and what's their mood. They don't have a clue who they are and what they need and want. And so they're now becoming whatever the other person wants. So they're getting smaller and smaller of their authentic self and becoming what somebody else wants. And then they get validated for that. And so they think, okay, this is finally working. This is good. And they go into adult life, they get a job, they fawn, they get validated for it, they get into a relationship, they fawn, they get validated for it. It looks like the perfect solution until they get into an intimate, committed relationship, and all of a sudden the other person is getting fed up with the fawning, or they're getting to a point where they go, how come my needs are never being met? Why am I always taking care of everybody else and sacrificing, and my needs are never being met? And they get more and more dissatisfied with their fawning behavior. That's then when they start to go, something's going on here that I need to begin to understand. And so when it comes to men, I think, again, all men are different, and I don't want to stereotype men at all, but I think culturally, there's still men are drawn to kind of action role behavior, busy, productive, high performing, responsible. And so the adaptations that men develop often trend in that direction. that caused them to try to become this strong, charismatic leader. But okay, let me come at it from this angle, Wes, that might help. What is happening when a child is fawning is they see themselves as inferior to mom and dad. My needs don't matter. Mom and dad's needs matter. I'm in the inferior position. And so that they learn how to do. And men do that just as much as women because that's what child have to do to survive. What I find is once they get to adult life and get into behaviors where they're not in survival mode anymore, that many men go, I'm not going to be the servant around here anymore. I'm the boss. And they go and actually become like their dad. I'm going to be the superior position. And if they come out of a patriarchal type of background where men are to rule and lead and women are to serve and take care of, they just get drawn into this, I'm now the superior position, and they actually become the very thing they hated as a child. But to me, it happens subconsciously for them. It's finally, I'm out of this painful place where I serve. Now I finally can get my needs taken care of, and the pendulum swings too far. And they now put themselves in a superior position where they then start inflicting the damage to the others. And typically, so if I can add one more piece to this, what's happened in the child thing is their template is relationships are superior, inferior. And they've learned how to be the inferior and they've learned how to be the superior. And so they're naturally attracted to somebody with a similar template. They're not attracted to somebody that sees, I'm just as important as you. My needs just matters just as much as yours. They're attracted to somebody with the same template and often the same shame issues that I'm not good enough and I have to prove myself. And so typically what can happen in adult relationships is they fluctuate. Some days they're superior, some days they're inferior. But the thing that's driving it often is my shame belief that I'm not good enough. And if you really get to know me, you'll abandon me. And I'm afraid of it being abandoned. So some days I'll be superior. If I'm confident that you're not going to abandon me, then I'm going to take charge and I might even be a neglectful or abusive. But if I'm afraid you're going to abandon me, I'm going to go back to inferior and fawning because fear of abandonment is actually driving a lot of what's going on at a subconscious level.
Yeah, that's really helpful to lay that out. And, it reminds me how in my work with a lot of men, because they tend to want to problem solve, they think, well, either if I carry out the act of people pleasing in an effective enough manner, or if I stop the maladaptive behavior, the addiction, whatever it is, that'll heal the issue. And they overlook the core wounding, the
Yes,
complex trauma that they had, which is, hey, instead of trying to stop pleasing your wife or setting a boundary, all that stuff's important. But
yes,
if you just did the action and you didn't have the understanding behind it and the integration of the healing from the past, you're just going to end back up here in a year
exactly.
because you don't have enough, capacity to continue to move forward. So I think it's helpful for guys to realize, hey, as much as you're trying to focus on working less or not people pleasing, standing up for yourself, all that stuff's great and the actions matter. But take a few steps back and ask yourself, who in childhood did I try to please the most? Mentioning your
Exactly.
validation, and how can I start there and work my way up?
So, what I see all the time with the people that I deal with is that as a culture, we become putting band-aid on symptoms culture. And so symptom, let's fix it. Let's send you to a counselor. Let's do this little step 1, 2, 3. That'll fix the symptoms. And men are very prone to that. It suits them. They just want to be a fixer. But where I see a lot of that coming from is if they were to go back to childhood, they weren't like that as a little child. If they were in pain, they expressed the pain. But then if they were told, don't feel that, or you're not really feeling that, or just do this, or go to your room and don't come out till you got a smile on your face, whatever, they basically weren't allowed to look at the core issues. Nobody wanted to deal with the symptom because nobody wanted to deal with the real issue. And so they just suppress that. And now they've just fallen into, let's just focus on symptoms. And if they're good at fixing stuff, then they think that should apply. But what I want them to hear is, what was that child experiencing? They weren't feeling seen or heard or understood. And what you're doing now when you just want to rush in and fix your child's symptoms is you're not seeing them, hearing them, or understanding them. When you want to rush in and fix your wife and her symptoms, you're not seeing, hearing, understanding. You're doing the very thing to them that was done to you that you hated. So we have to learn to see, hear, and understand. And that means not just the symptoms. What's going on below the symptoms? What are the emotions? What are the fears? What are the thinking? What's the wound down there that they're responding to? Until I can get them, I'm going to misdiagnose stuff. I'm not going to fix the right stuff. I got to get them to diagnose properly what's really the issue here.
Yeah, that one hit home when you said we're just doing to others what we hated or what was done to us. One of my favorite authors on the subject, Jim Finley, he says we ritualistically reenact the traumatized parts of ourselves onto others. And it seems like this is that until we get down to the core beneath what's going on, we'll never resolve it. And speaking of getting beneath, you talk about how the trauma creates an internal instinct to stay safe at all costs and affects our brain's wiring for protection rather than connection. So, for men who've built their identity around being providers and protectors, which we know are the kind of two main archetypes or roles that men tend to play, how can they begin to distinguish between healthy protective instincts and trauma driven hypervigilance that's actually damaging their relationships and peace of mind?
And I've spent 40 years thinking about this question. So when I started 40 years ago, I thankfully grew up in a home where my mom and dad let me go deep and connect at a very deep level. And so I craved that. I realized that that was a need. I realized how healing it was for me, how enriching it was for me. And I just craved that. But what I found when I went out, left home and went out on my own, is I would join different support groups and stuff like that. And nobody was going to that deep level. It was just like superficial sharing around a certain topic, around fun, around whatever. And it was like, how do I get men, especially, that there's just this resistance to go to a deeper level of connection? And so I just worked and worked and worked on that. And there's no magic thing. But what I found helped was I'd get a group like 3 or 4 guys and we get together and I would basically have to lead the way into a little deeper, not too deep yet, but just one step at a time, a little deeper, that they still felt was a little bit safe, but starting to get a little bit threatening. And I would have to share at that level and take the initiative and not just ask them to share there out of the blue. I had to kind of set the pace. And what I would usually find out of the 3, 4, 5 guys is 1 or 2 would be willing to do that. Others, that's totally out of their comfort zone. But then to take that 1 or 2 and then the next time go a wee bit deeper and a wee bit deeper. And over time, beginning to get men to the point where they realize, wow, this is safe to go here, but boy, is it ever meaningful to go here. All this stuff we've been searching for is actually found in the very thing we've been afraid to do. That connection, that sense of being seen and heard and understood is so being authentic and vulnerable is with safe people is where it at. So what I always want people in complex trauma to realize is that complex trauma creates in the child's brain bad math. So in their mind, it's connection equals rejection. And that's the equation that if you try to connect, you'll get rejected. What they don't realize and know because of their limited experience is they've only tried to connect with unsafe people. And so the real occasion is connection with unsafe people equals rejection. What they have to relearn is that connection with safe people actually leads to everything you're looking for. But that's a scary thing, is to say, okay, we're now going to try connection again after all your experiences have been with unsafe people and resulted in hurt. We're now going to try it with a couple safe people. That's triggers fear big time. But if they're willing to try it gradually, then they can find a new math equation that leads to the very things they've always been looking for. And so part of that math equation is, if connection always equals rejection, it's authenticity and trying to connect is what led to rejection. So I had to be fake in order to try to find connection. So now connection with safe people I can be authentic. That's a scary thing too. And so you're just gradually letting them create a new math equation that's actually accurate, but it's got to be with safe people.
Yeah, that's so good. And I love that more literal formulaic framework there, because in my understanding of it, and I'd be curious if I'm heading in the right direction here, is that really they've read this script their whole lives, and it's this entire whole movie almost, but their head is down, they're just reading the script. And instead of wiping it all out and giving them a blank page or replacing all of it, it sounds like a gradual or developmental approach that helps them feel safe, but that should also feel consistently challenging. It's not getting
Exactly.
complacent at all. In groups of other men, which I think is also powerful, because it's one thing to say, open up to your spouse or to a random person, but I think the group provides a safety, and there's this not sense of direct pressure, which I'd love to get into in a second, of why a lot of men don't like therapy or being forced to open up to their wives, because it seems like the script is wipe clean and they have to just start it all again. It sounds like being in the presence of other men who are also resistant, but make the choice in that moment to show up in a safe manner that's gradual, is the key to a man learning how to be vulnerable, accepting his past, integrating his wound, and finding a healthier way forward.
Very much. So, a couple things with that. Like, to me, it's so significant that most men think they're not controlled by fear. We're strong. We don't have fear. But really, they're scared to death of being vulnerable, of connecting. And so that's why there's resistance, is because there's fear. And so it's what I want everybody in recovery to realize is that to get healthy, you got to go through fear. Every time you take a step in a healthy direction, you're going to trigger a fear response. And that is, if I go here, I'm going to get hurt. If I go here, I'm going to look stupid. If I go here, I'm going to get rejected. So all growth is through fear. And courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is doing the right thing in the face of fear. And men have to realize, okay, it's all right to feel fear. I don't have to quickly just go the other direction and say, I'm not feeling fear. I'm just not going to do that. So you got to go through the fear, but you got to do it gradually. You can't just dump them into the deep end. You got to let them go into the waiting end. But to me, there's a second thing around that. When we have fears at a subconscious level, we then create a belief system around it to try to justify it and make it look righteous. And so what many men do is, I'm supposed to be the strong one. I don't need therapy. Meanwhile, there's a stigma in society that men, if they go to therapy, are weak, and therefore that makes them look bad. So that's why there's more fear of what culture's going to say that's driving them. But there's also a belief system that men have to be a certain way to be strong. But that belief system is full of a lot of lies that they have to begin to confront. And so there's fear and lies that are working together to keep men in this very stuck position and telling themselves that that's strong. But man, it just cripples them and keeps them in a prison, really. So it's just, yeah, exactly what you said, Wes. It's just this very gradual moving towards addressing my fear, walking through my fear, taking the healthy steps of being authentic and connecting, that just begins to have a snowball effect of positive effects.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. And shifting gears into talking about why traditional therapy or other programs don't tend to have as high a success rate as you've had, which is phenomenal at 68%, especially in addiction treatment. Curious what makes your approach particularly effective for men who might be resistant to all these other treatments they've tried? And what would you say to a man who is skeptical about whether this kind of work could actually help him? This seems to be a common theme, at least for me, even in therapy, of having to do a pitch, at the beginning and get their openness, which I find my clients who are women tend to just naturally say, I'm ready, let's go for it and talk about it.
I think, again, a lot of the approach to treatment in the past has been fix symptoms. So let's get a quick fix. And basically, to me, the big picture is, what's the ultimate damage done by trauma? And it's the lack of connection. And all of the coping styles has been trying to find life without connection. And it can lead to a bunch of different pleasures, but it always ends up in deeper and deeper pain and emptiness. And so why don't a lot of trauma or addiction programs work, is because they're just trying to fix symptoms without providing the tools for true connection and helping push people that you don't heal just by getting information. You don't heal by just doing steps 1, 2, 3. You also, those are all important, but you also have to find connection with safe people. That becomes the heart. That's what you've been longing for since you were born and you've never been able to find. And so what we do is provide tons of information, tons of tools, but then the connection piece becomes what most of our clients will say has become the most important thing. They came in thinking they were going to learn all this information and tools and that was going to fix it and everything. And then they go, but once we started to connect, then we realized, wow, we finally found the very thing that we've been looking for all our life. That seems particularly difficult for men because men have prided themselves on being independent. I don't need anybody. I'm self-sufficient. And it's the humbling of ourselves to say, it's all right to need people. It's all right to connect. There's a beauty in that. I want to connect with my kids. I'm happy about that desire to connect. So why shouldn't I be happy about wanting to connect with others? And so it's really kind of shedding a lot of that old mindset about what a man should be and just go, let's deconstruct a lot of that is crap. I want to be an authentic human. I want to, and that means a connecting human. And I want to begin to experience that. So we're seeing more and more men who are really starting to connect. And to me, it's one of the most beautiful things to see men becoming all that they were really meant to be, and to experience the joy of that kind of connection.
Yeah, that's well said. I couldn't agree more. And I would even add with telling men it's not just okay to have connection. I like to challenge them and say it's essential. Good luck being
Exactly.
functional unless you're relational. And that component of being challenged to see what they previously have seen as optional as essential tends to click with a lot of guys to say, I know you think that it's normal and that you're okay blah, 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 with being isolated, self reliant, all the things you mentioned. But let me ask you something. If we're talking about a pure functional level and how well you're moving in the world, your quality of life, how's that going for you? Because you probably wouldn't be here or you wouldn't be struggling with what you are if things were firing on all cylinders. So, how can you start to reframe the connection and the belonging as essential and prioritize it? And I think this is the way forward. I was listening to a big podcast, The Diary of a CEO, and they had a couple of top experts who research men. And, they go through all these stats about how, how boys don't have a lot of men in their life and all this stuff. And then at the end, the interviewer says, well, what's the solution? And they just said, I don't know, but I think it's just gathering men. I think it's getting men together. And, I thought, wow, we've gone through this whole journey here and the answer is connection and belonging at its core and how
Exactly.
simple, but how powerful. I'm curious if you could leave guys with one core message or thing to remember, or a place to start. Where would that be?
I think in my mind, it's guys, the things that we've been wanting, we've been given the wrong recipe to find. And we've got to be willing to be curious to check out that there's other recipes there that are proving to deliver what they promise. It's going to be a bit scary at times. It's going to push you way out of your comfort zone. It might go against some of your family values that you were raised with, but it's well worth it if you pursue this path of therapy, healing, getting healthy.
Well said. And I'm curious if people do want to start the journey of healing, where can they find your work to understand more?
Yeah, so our website is timfletchercode.ca, and then we have a YouTube channel where people can watch videos on complex trauma and all the characteristics. On the website, we have an online course that people can take. We have self-study courses that people can take on various topics. So there's a bunch of different options. And so you don't have to dive into the 15-week course. You can do little smaller bites that are more suitable for you. But I just encourage people to start exploring and trying some of this stuff because the more information you get and it starts connecting dots for you, that's going to get you moving in the right direction.
Yes. Well, thank you for your work and providing some of those breadcrumbs for a guy to kind of follow into the trail of healing and integrating and facing a lot of the trauma and recovery that's essential. And just thank you for the work you're doing in the world and being so generous with offering some guidance and wisdom along the way. So, guys, until next time, we'll make sure to put everything in the show notes and to check out Tim and his group's work. And thank you again for your time.
Thank you, Wes.